Hello and welcome to our online course, 17th Century English Research. My name is Ginevra Morse, Vice President of Education and Programming here at American Ancestors and New England Historic Genealogical Society. I will be moderating today's event. In the 17th century, tens of thousands of English men, women, and children immigrated and settled in America. Today, there are tens of millions of Americans who descend from these early settlers. But what of their previous lives and ancestry in England? In this 4-week online course, genealogist Elsa Churchill of the Society of Genealogists, the premier and largest genealogical society in the UK, will provide practical research strategies, an overview of essential and lesser-known resources, and illustrative case studies to take your research to the next level. We are absolutely thrilled to welcome as our instructor for the course, Elsa Churchill, genealogist at the Society of Genealogists in the United Kingdom. She has 30 years experience as a professional genealogical librarian and researcher. Formerly the librarian of the Institute of Heraldic and Genealogical Studies. Elsa now leads the SOG's education and publishing program, as well as being the Society's subject specialist. She has appeared on both the UK and American television show, Who Do You Think You Are? She has written many articles for the British Genealogical Press, the national media, and of course the Society's own Genealogists magazine. Elsa has acted as a genealogical consultant for the BBC's web-based genealogical enquiries and news group. She lectures regularly for the Society of Genealogists, the National Archives, and for local groups around the UK, Canada, New Zealand, and the US. So in this first class, we'll discuss kind of the historical context of this period in England and reasons for migrating to the New World. We will then provide tips for preparing your research and give an overview of some of the key sources we'll be discussing over the next few weeks. You'll find a PDF of today's slides at the online course page, as well as a handout. And starting tomorrow, you'll be able to watch a recording of today's presentation on that course page. So if you miss anything on today's first listen, don't worry. You can go back, watch, rewatch as many times as you like the recording from today's class until the end of February. Also, before moving on, I do want to note that we are, of course, broadcasting from our homes to your home, and for the next 4 weeks from 2 different continents. We do apologize in advance if there are any interruptions, and we thank you for your patience. If we do lose the connection for any reason, you will still have access to a full recording. And again, please make sure that you remain muted throughout the presentation. You will be able to ask questions by typing them into the chat panel, and Elsa will answer as many as she can during 3 Q&A sessions. All right, so without further ado, I will turn things over to our instructor.
Hello there, everyone. Thank you so much for coming along this evening. Or it's evening here, I think it's afternoon where you are. You are so lucky to know anything about your 17th century English ancestors. Remember, the 17th century is one of the greatest periods of upheaval in English history, including religious and political schism, the English civil wars of 1642 to 49, the execution of a king resulting in the period of the Commonwealth and Protectorate of Oliver Cromwell, and that century saw the first steps to creating an English empire and tremendous developments in transport, technology and science. To be honest, few English genealogists can get their ancestry back into the 17th century. Most will find insurmountable brick walls in the 18th century caused by mobility, industrialisation, non-conformity, etc., which means most English family trees peter out about 1750 to 1850. Even after nearly 40 years of research, I only have one line, my Churchill line, that goes back as far as the man having children baptised in the 1680s. Presumably, he was born sometime in the 1650s to the 1660s, but local records such as parish registers, wills and land records don't survive for the area he comes from, and there are many other factors which will inhibit my progress. And to be honest, we don't have as many land records which gets us back into the 17th century as you have on your side of the Atlantic. So I'm going to be talking about the sources that will help us hop that pond. And the talk will be in 3, not necessarily equal parts, with a brief pause for Q&As between each part and at the end. As Genevieve said, we'll be talking about a little bit of historical context, looking at the England your ancestors left, the prerequisite questions that all genealogists must ask, the who, when, where and why of the situation. And then I really want to stress some things that you should do to prepare your search, to understand what's been done before, and before you start researching on this side of the pond, and also to have a little overview of some of the repositories and archives that are mentioned throughout the course. So I'll just give you an idea of what they are at the end. I'm afraid I have quite a bit to pack in, and I'm British, as you've probably noticed, so I do speak rather quickly, so I hope you can keep up with me. And of course the talk is being recorded, as Jeanette said, so you can refer back to there, and there's the PDF copy of the slides and a syllabus of notes for each talk. So I hope that will make things clear. I should make clear right from the beginning that neither I nor the Society of Genealogists does professional genealogical casework. Rather, it's my job to help you to do your research yourself, but I am available on my email if you need talk or advice. And so we go on to the next slide. The 17th century is one of the greatest periods of upheaval in English history. It includes religious and political schisms, the death of the Tudor Queen Elizabeth, and the ascent of the new Stuart dynasty, with the reigns of James I and his son Charles I, the English Civil War from 1642 to 9, the execution of the king, resulting in the period of the Commonwealth and the Protectorate of Oliver Cromwell, and the restoration of Charles II was followed by his brother James II. It was a time of religious upheaval, the rooting of English Protestantism and the established Church of England, of growing religious factionalism, Puritan protests and anti-Catholic feeling. The post-Restoration settlement saw the Popish plot and the banishment of the Catholic King James in favour of his Protestant daughter Mary and her husband King William of Orange. The Glorious Revolution of 1688 saw the reign of William and Mary and the defeat of James at the Battle of the Boyne in Ireland. The century saw wars with France, Spain and the Dutch, and made the first steps to creating that empire, with tremendous developments in transport, technology and finance. Next slide. And this turbulence is shown in English history. It's shown from the Gunpowder Plot of 1605, an attempt to assassinate the king in Parliament, the bloody civil wars, and the beheading of Charles I. The Great Fire of London was the last in 1666, succeeding the most great plague in 1665. But as in other European cities of the period, the plague was endemic in 17th century London, and the disease periodically erupted into massive epidemics. There were 30,000 deaths due to the plague in 1603, 35,000 in 1625, and 10,000 in 1636, and as well as smaller numbers in the city throughout the years, and there were regular outbreaks across the country throughout the century. The majority of people during the era of Stuart Britain were poor, with a large portion living in terrible poverty. More often than not, they're in rural parishes in the countryside. The 16th century had witnessed a surge in population, which had a negative impact on living standards and led to an increase in poverty and hunger. Indeed, poverty was such a problem during the early modern period, which is what English historians say is roughly from the mid-15th century to the mid-18th century, that poor laws were instituted. What became popularly known as the Elizabethan Poor Law, or the Old Poor Law, was passed right at the beginning of our century in 1601, in the reign of Elizabeth I. And this created a poor law system for England and Wales in order to help relieve the poorest in society. The Act of Settlement in 1662 confirmed the practice that tied people to their settled parish, which should support them in times of need. Vagrancy was a major problem during this period. Before the institution of a modern welfare state, the poorest relied upon charity from family, neighbours and their fellow townspeople, and from begging. Some of the poor emigrated from the British Isles to the burgeoning colonies in the New World, and according to historian John Murrell, more people emigrated from Britain than immigrated into it during this period. Although many people lived hand to mouth in the first half of the Stuart period, things improved somewhat in the later period, because labouring families became able to work, and not only to survive, but to have a more comfortable standard of living than their ancestors before them. The paucity of food resources for many people meant that the principal aim of each day was finding their next meal. In a time when only limited foodstuffs were available, people depended heavily upon the harvest. To make matters worse, during the Civil War, hungry soldiers, who often had their pay in arrears, would often plunder ordinary people's stocks of food and livestock, leading to undernourishment or even starvation. Those who worked in the countryside in agriculture had jobs involving all aspects of husbandry, including milking cows, collecting eggs from chickens, toiling in the fields, and other tasks associated with livestock and crop rotation and cultivation. Next slide. Wealthier merchants, whom we would today classify as middle class, largely prospered during the Stuart period. When the plague catastrophically swept through London in 1665, it was this group of people who, like the aristocracy above them, were better able to flee from that scene of pestilence to parts of the countryside where plague was less likely. In towns, people were employed as shoemakers, smithies, tailors, porters, saddlers, glovers, chimney sweeps, amongst all sorts of other things. On the streets were people selling a variety of objects, from mops to oysters and human wares, and prostitution was rife. The towns, which were boroughs with formal charters from the Crown, had a degree of autonomy to govern their own markets, trade, taxes and politics. They were freemen with their rights and responsibilities to employ apprentices, to pay taxes, and they sat as jurors to judge on their peers. They traded with each other in networks formed from family, neighbours, friends and religion, and in many cases they took these networks with them and continued them across the Atlantic. And here we've got the list of the largest, just go back to that slide, Geneva, if I can briefly. Here's a list of the top 30 towns in England, as shown from the highest in this period, with a population of London from about 350,000. And you can see that the towns below it were Norwich, York, Bristol, etc., many of which had ports from which people could migrate. Next slide. Generally, much more information is available to us as genealogists about the wealthier, select groups of people than there is about anything else. The wealthy were more likely to be well educated, or educated enough so that they could read and write, and therefore we have more written accounts from them and about their lives. The common people, although no less interesting, are largely illiterate, so their stories tend to be shared orally, and many have been lost over time. English society was organised hierarchically, with a tightly defined ascending order of privileges and responsibilities. This hierarchy was as apparent in the family as it was in the state. In the family as elsewhere, male domination was the rule. Husbands ruled their wives, masters their servants, parents their children. But if hierarchy was stratified, it was not ossified. Those who attained wealth could achieve status. The social hierarchy reflected gradations of wealth and responded to changes in the economic fortunes of individuals. During the early 17th century, a small titular peerage composed of between 75 and 100 peers of the realm formed the apex of the social structure. Their titles were hereditary, passed from father to eldest son, and they were amongst the wealthiest subjects of the state. Most were local magnates, inheriting vast country estates and occupying honorific positions in local government. The peerage was the military class of the nation, and in the counties, peers held the office of Lord Lieutenant. Most were also called to serve at court in the presence of the king, but at the beginning of the century, their power was still local rather than central. Below the peers were the gentry, who probably comprised only about 5% of the rural population, but who were rising in importance and prestige. The gentry were not distinguished by title, though many were knights and several hundred purchased the rank of baronet, that's hereditary knighthoods, after it was created in 1611 by James I. A definition of a member of the gentry is that he, or the man, that can bear the port and charge of a gentleman. The gentleman would have a coat of arms, and he would be act to his status in life. The gentry were expected to provide hospitality to their neighbours, treat their tenants paternally, and govern their counties. They served as deputy lieutenants, militia captains, and most importantly, as justices of the peace. To the justices fell the responsibilities of enforcing the king's law and keeping the king's peace. They worked individually to mediate local disputes and collectively at quarter sessions to try petty crimes. As the magistracy, the gentry were the backbone of county government, and they maintained a fierce local independence even when enforcing the edicts of the crown. And more importantly, they are the employers of our poor ancestors, and they are the families from which many younger sons came to the colonies. Next paragraph. So, next slide. It was the gentry that governed the county. The Lord Lieutenant and Sheriff represented the king in their shire, which were often more closely aligned to each other in their regions than to the capital, which was several days' ride from the northern counties. So the regions of East Anglia and the home counties on the east of England, around London, these are the regions where the counties showed their allegiance to each other. We have the old Saxon kingdoms known as Wessex and Mercia, or more commonly known as the West Country, with Devon and Cornwall down in the southwest, the Midlands, the North, and the borderlands up abutting Scotland. Within the county was the overlying administration of the government, the court circuits, the local sessions, the hundred and the parish. Over that lies the church with its archdiocese and the diocese within them, the archdeaconry and the parish. A man living in 17th century England would show his allegiance and relationship with God, his family, his neighbours, his master, his landlord, the lord of the manor, the parish constable and the justice of the peace, to the county gentry, to the judge, to king, and to God again. So, to that end, we'll be looking later in the course at the records and resources that reflect this hierarchy of government and what genealogically can be gleaned about the 17th century ancestors that were governed in this hierarchy. So we'll be looking at the vestry and the parish officials, the parish in which our ancestors lived, the incumbents, the officers of the parish, the overseers of the poor, the church wardens and the constable. We'll understand the hierarchy of the church and the church courts with looking at the prerogative courts of the archbishops, the consistory courts of the bishops, and the archdeaconry church courts with the officers that appeared in them, with the proctors, apparitors, etc. We'll be looking at the quarter session and assize courts under the jurisdiction of the justices of the peace and magistrates. We'll look at the manners in which our ancestors lived and worked, the manorial courts and the customary laws and laws of the manor, and the officers of that lord of the manor, such as the steward and the reeve and the manorial constable, who all had impact on our ancestors' lives. And we'll look briefly at the civil and equity courts, the courts of chancery and exchequer, the court of requests and star chamber, and wards and liveries, where we will see how our ancestors interacted with each other and the clues you can glean. And we'll pause there briefly of the historical background. I can see a few things coming up with questions, and we'll take questions now.
Great. Well, thank you, Elsa. And yes, let's pause here, type anything that you would like to ask in the chat panel, and we'll try to get to as many as we can in the next few minutes. So Marion asks, what percentage of the gentry owned land?
Most gentry owned land. The gentry comprises about 5% of the population, but I don't know. I would make a guess. The vast majority of estates were owned by the peers and the aristocracy under the, well, all land is technically owned by the crown. Then the vast estates of the aristocracy, but they sublet it and it was run by the gentry. So the gentry were a small part of the population, but a significantly powerful and wealthy part because of the land they either owned and rented. So I think between them, I think we can safely say that the aristocracy and the landowning dukes, etc., and the gentry underneath them probably owned 85 to 90% of the land.
Wow. Okay. If someone wants to learn more about kind of this time period, or especially the hierarchy, which is, something that I think Americans aren't that familiar with, are there suggested resources or readings?
Lots. I can put together a little bibliography of some general books to read in background if you want, and I'll get Genève to distribute that if that's probably the easiest ones. I am going to come up with some books in the next section, which I'm going to recommend. And some of those have got some good historical background. And the other things I would recommend is possibly just some general chronological timelines. There are some excellent sort of timelines put out by local history societies and universities, and even the BBC has an excellent free history resource on the BBC website with sort of timelines for the 17th century, and I'll put a couple of links to those in the handouts as well.
That would be great, and a lot of people are saying yes, please.
Yeah, we'll do.
Timelines.
Yeah,
wonderful.
I'll put. I've got a slide and some links which I'll let Genève distribute rather than me turn around quickly, look at my bookcases behind me and say you need to read this. I could go on forever. That'll take a bit of time, but I'll give you the reading list.
Great, and we can certainly include that in the course materials.
Yeah, that's fine.
Now, Holly's asking about if you could give a description or definition of some of the terms that we just showed. Incumbent, proctors, summoners.
Oh well, I'll describe. I will all of those. That was just an overview of what I'm going to cover, and I will go through all of those in the appropriate parts of the course. So I'll explain terms like what the vestry was, how the parish worked, what an apparitor did in the church courts. Don't worry, that was just me to entice you with some nice things, but you'll hear all about those in the course.
Perfect. And Mary asks, how do the guilds fit into this period?
They're there. They're very much involved. The system of guilds around the country tends to be in the county towns with boroughs and charters from the crown, which allowed the guilds to administer trade in their area. Now, the famous guilds are in the City of London, with the guilds and city livery companies, which from the medieval period very much regulated trade in the City of London. And then they came to take on other roles, pastoral care for their members, land ownership. You didn't necessarily join the guild that your trade was associated with, because there are a number of reasons why you could join a guild in London. For example, your father might have been a member of a guild, or you might have married the freeman of a guild's daughter. So the guilds are very influential in London with their records, and they also have some of the sort of charter towns and cities like Norwich, York, where this becomes less of a trade regulation and more of a an idea that you have to be a freeman of the city so that you can vote, and you've become a freeman because you might have served an apprenticeship, and then you can take on your own masters. So the medieval guilds are really changing in this period from the 17th century. So in some cities like London, the guilds and city livery companies hold on to their strength, and there are lots of records of the guilds and city livery companies. In some of the towns, not so much. But when I will talk a little bit about that later on.
Great. And Paul asks, is there a standard pronunciation guide for English surnames and place names?
Pronunciation, I think we'll find that pronunciation of place names and surnames is very open to dialect in England. So you will find that there are places, for example, near where I live, there's a place that most people would read it as Shepherd's Wold, but it was pronounced Sibbott's Wold. And so I would say that English names and place names, in fact, are not standardized. So while the most authoritative source is going to be the Oxford English Dictionary, and that's be the place I would start to help with an understanding of how things might be pronounced. There is the Oxford Dictionary of Place Names as well, but I'm not sure it tells you how to pronounce them particularly.
All right. And Deborah asks, if someone can read and write in the 1600s, does that mean that they were part of the gentry?
I think you can pretty much guarantee that all the gentry would be able to read and write, but that doesn't mean to say that anyone who could read and write would be part of the gentry. We do have a formation of education in, grammar schools. I mean, for example, in the 16th century, Shakespeare was an educated man in the local grammar school in Stratford. But his father wasn't a member of the gentry. His father was a glover, I think, and he was a tradesman. So we're starting to see a growing ability for literacy for those where it was important to them. They had to practice their trades. They were merchants. So I wouldn't say that an indication that someone was literate meant they were part of the gentry class. No.
Okay. And Mary asks, or says, many of the county towns are common names in my part of New England. So, we have in New England lots of names that were originally in England. Does that mean that immigrants, were naming their new area after where they came from, or is that not necessarily kind of one-to-one?
Yes, I'm going to talk about that in the next section. But the argument is, yes, a lot of people came from the regions where those names are common. So if you have names like East Anglian names in New England, it's quite possible that the people who founded them and named it from the region they were associated and knew. But that's just a majority, and there's quite a long tail of those who didn't come from those areas. They're clues, but they're not rules.
All right. And Lyle asks, does a person having a written will in 1578 indicate that they are a gentry or gentleman?
No. If you'll find someone that's got a will, there will be property. They might be farmers, they might be husbandmen, they might be middle-class traders, artisans. If they are a gentleman and consider themselves of the gentry class, they will usually say gentleman, and that's when the hairs on the back of your neck should stand up saying, right, someone that describes himself as a gentleman may have land, property, something to, and be searchable and researchable.
All right.
I see Brian.
Yeah, a few other questions.
I saw this one. Brian's asking, would the poor be less likely to emigrate during this period? Wait until the next section, Brian.
That's what I was going to say. I was going to use that as a nice transition.
That's right.
So why don't we move on to the next section? And like I said, there are a few other questions that I see that I will ask during the next Q&A. But let's get to kind of who went and more about those details. So back over to you.
Yeah. Okay. So as yes, Geneva says, in this second part, we're going to be looking at the people who went, when did they go, where did they go to and from, and why did they go? And this is something that I want to get sort of every researcher that's doing English genealogy to start asking these questions: who, what, when, where, and why. And there's these are questions that you have to ask yourself all the time. Now, according to the wonderful textbook, a source, a genealogical handbook of a guidebook of American genealogy, total emigration to the United States prior to the time it ceased to be a British colony was broken down according to this pie chart, with England making immigrants from England making up 26% of those who had arrived in the colonies by, and then as it gradually moves into, the Scots, the Ulster Scots, and then Europe, Germany, Switzerland. But none of those are as large as the number of African enslaved people who were forced to come to America. And we're, of course, going to be looking at the English chronology of emigration to the USA in the 1600s. So if we go on to the next slide, Genève. I really recommend doing some background reading and history in the process. And I said I'll give you some historical background to reading if you want. But there's plenty of books that I certainly recommend if you're going to be doing 17th century migration research from England. Then you ought to have these books on your bookshelves. I absolutely recommend you read Robert Charles Anderson's Puritan Pedigrees, The Deep Roots of the Great Migration of New England. I like the argument, I don't always agree with it, but I like the arguments and the exposition that David Hackett Fisher puts in his book Albion Seeds for British Pathways, and I'm going to be looking at that in quite a bit of detail, as I am going to be looking at James Evans' book that came out a couple of years ago and was very popular over here, Emigrants, Why the English Sailed to the New World. And Stephen, and of course, because we're celebrating the Mayflower at the moment, Stephen Tompkins' books, The Journey to the Mayflower, the origins of God's outlaws and the invention of the freedoms. But I think these are some things you really ought to be seriously reading. And for historical background, I do think the argument that David Hackett puts together is interesting to read. So we've got the short chronology that all of these books kind of reflect, that we have the foundation of Jamestown in Virginia by English colonists in 1607. We have the Mayflower carrying pilgrims into Massachusetts in 1620. And of course, the onset of the Great Migration, that flood of Puritan migrations to New England from 1629 to 1640, really sort of drawn to a halt by the outbreak of the Civil War. In 1634, Lord Baltimore founded Maryland as a haven for English Catholics who were also facing persecution in England. After the outbreak of the Civil War in England, we see the end of the Puritan migration, but with the defeat of the Royalist armies, we have Royalist sympathisers escaping Parliament to the colonies in America, and with the restoration of King Charles II in 1660, he restored to the monarchy, but was officially discouraging people from leaving England. He wanted people to stay and settle and create wealth in the country. But that didn't last very long, and the courtiers around him, anxious to make money, establish the proprietary colonies in the Carolinas. They start, they start looking to Virginia as a form of income. And then, of course, we have the more religious migrations from Quakers founded Pennsylvania in 1681. And the breaking of the slave trade monopoly of the Royal African Company meant that the slave trade expands rapidly to bring cheaper labour, or free labour, I should say, into the Americas, and with meaning that there is less need for poor people to be shipped over to serve in the colonies. And we're going to be looking at all of these in a certain element. Next slide, please. So there were many reasons why migrants went to America. Some went voluntarily and others under duress. They had religious, political and economic motives. Migration ranged from the entrepreneurial founders of the Virginia Company, who bought indentured labourers in bondage to work in return for passage, food and possibly land. We've seen the religious migrants from New England as part of the Great Migration, with the Royalists fleeing after the defeat of the Civil War. And as Jeanette said right at the beginning, this is a time when thousands emigrated. In the course of the whole 17th century, almost 200,000 people arrived in the English colonies in America from England, at its height in the 1620s and 1630s. Nearly half of them were indentured servants. In places like Virginia, where the demand for menial labour was high, the proportion was even larger. The impoverished and the desperate, who were facing times of poor harvest and hunger in England in the 1620s and 1630s, were shipped over the Atlantic to meet this demand for labour, and thus order at home was maintained. The sorts who emigrated voluntarily tended not to be the very poorest, but those who were in what we would call but they were those who we would call the lower middle classes. Of the teeming masses of poor, unemployed, uneducated children, the City of London was recorded to be quite desirous to be disburdened of them. And I would argue that they were the ones who went involuntarily and are probably less known. Next slide, please. Now, Albion Seed is a fantastic book to read, and David Hackett Fisher describes in here what he calls 4 folk pathways to America in his book Albion Seed. So from the 17th century perspectives, the top 3 are the most pertinent. He suggests that as much as 60% of migrants in each of these 3 groups, the Puritans, the Cavaliers and indentured servants to Virginia, and the Friends to the Delaware Basin. He says 60% of migrants in each of those groups are from recognised regional origins in England. And their activity and life in America reflects the genealogical connections of family, association and neighbours, and all sorts of other interconnections from the places where they came from. I would suggest that if it's as high as that, and that about 60% of each of these groups are known and known where they come from, that means there's a substantial minority, i.e. up to about 40% of migrants, who were in those areas in America, but didn't follow the recognised pathways. They weren't Puritans from East Anglia, but they were still in Massachusetts. They weren't necessarily from the south of west of England, but ended up in Virginia. And it's these people whose origins are the most challenging and remain to be discovered. So Fisher describes as the exodus of the English Puritans in 1620 to 1641, those people who came largely from East Anglian market towns and cities to Massachusetts. Like Bob Anderson in his book Puritan Pedigrees, he sees these migrants as an interconnected network of people founded by faith, kinship, values, education, and regional communities. Faith families prayed and worked together and intermarried in England and in the new colony. They stuck together and paid their own way, and they were often literate, skilled artisans. And so we might recognise about 60% of people coming in New England from that story, but there are others that don't. Similarly, Fisher considers what he calls the distressed cavaliers, or the indentured servants who migrated to Virginia between 1642 and 1675 from the outbreak and the aftermath of the English Civil War. He says these migrants largely came from the south and west of England to Virginia. And again, those cavaliers and pioneers, as they're rather romantically described by Nell Nugent in her indexes to those immigrants who received Virginia land grants, and which can be found in good libraries and on the Internet Archive. These cavaliers were the royalist recusants and the younger sons of minor gentry English county families who left a hierarchical society in England and under Governor William Berkeley founded in Virginia an elite, or what was known as topping families, or as some people might describe them, upwardly mobile entrepreneurs using their social networks to further their positions. But they weren't Puritans and they were largely Anglicans. But the indentured servants who migrated to Virginia at this time were from a far lower socioeconomic group than the Cavaliers, of course. And they were considered by the Puritan New Englanders as profane people. But Hacker suggests significantly they were not the very lowest. He suggests they were more likely to come from agrarian communities, but they weren't destitute vagrants and destitute, at least not the ones we know about. Their passage was paid for in return for labour, and he suggests that about 2/3 of the Virginian colonists were poor, but not destitute. They were country unskilled labourers or agrarian tenants who worked the land for others. They were uneducated and illiterate, and it's thought that before 1650, as many as 80 to 90% of them sailed from London and the southeast, and the home counties around London, and they recruited from this region where they sailed. After the 1650s, Bristol became the main trading port for the Americas in the West, and again, many of the servant migrants sailed from there and were recruited from the southwest region. Albion Seeds describes the Quaker migration from the latter part of the 17th century and into the 18th century as coming from areas he describes as the North Midlands to the Delaware. Individual Quakers had appeared in the American colonies earlier than this, from as early as the 1650s, shortly after the Society of Friends was founded in England. And they were punished cruelly by Puritans and Anglican colonies alike, just as they had been in England. The larger movement became to be called the Friends Migration. The first Friends who settled around the Delaware River were John Fenwick, Edward Wade, John Wade, and Richard Noble. They formed a settlement at Salem, New Jersey in 1675. In 1681, King Charles II allowed William Penn, a Quaker, a charter for the area that was to become Pennsylvania. Other ships followed, and altogether as many as 23,000 colonists moved to the Delaware Valley between 1675 and 1715, including the 2,000 immigrants who arrived in 1682 and founded Pennsylvania. Quaker migrants were accompanied by many others who were not Friends, but who were sympathetic to the values of the sect. And not all were from England. There were numerous Welsh and some Irish, as well as Dutch and German, reflecting how Quakerism had spread across Europe. And the social origins of English Friends were diverse. Some family networks prevailed, but not as strongly as in New England. They were humbler in origin, but again, not the meanest sort. Husbandmen, manual workers, artisan tradesmen, merchants, and small shopkeepers were all Friends who migrated. While Friends may refuse to doff their hats to a proud man and recline at the idea of a Quaker elite, there was intermarrying and a closed community based on their industry and commerce as well as their faith. Documented Friends migration draws heavily from the North and North Midlands in the counties of Cheshire, Lancashire, the Pennine Moors, the Peak District and the Fells of Yorkshire, as well as Derbyshire and Nottinghamshire. There were few Friends from the South and West, and even rarer from East Anglia, and others came via London and Bristol. But again, those are the ones we know about. Of course, English migration to North America starts in the 16th century, with adventurers coming to fish and hunt fur. But these first adventurers were largely transitory and not settled. Two attempts had been made by Sir Walter Raleigh to found the first permanent English settlements in North America. The English, led by Humphrey Guildford, had claimed St. John's, Newfoundland in 1583, and this was the first North American English colony by royal prerogative of Queen Elizabeth. Roanoke was the second. The first Roanoke colony was established by Governor Richard Lane in 1585 on Roanoke Island, in what is now Dare County, North Carolina. Virginia was named as a colony for the Tudor Virgin Queen Elizabeth, who died in 1603. The London Company, also called the Virginia Company of London, was an English joint stock company established in 1606 by royal charter by King James I with the purpose of establishing royal colonial settlements in North America. In the troubled Jamestown, things were far from easy. Now, the records of the Virginian Company were published as 4 volumes by the Washington Government Printing Office between 1906 and 1933. And a revision of these and previously unpublished transcripts from the company have now been published online as the Virginia Company Archives. And this has led to a reinterpretation of the sources. For example, it was first thought that the list of women sent to the Jamestown colony to be wives or brides in 1619-20 characterized these women as the sweepings of the street. But research has shown that this is far from the case. Jennifer Potter's incredibly detailed examination of the lives, the genealogy, and the origins of these women who answer the Virginia Company's call for young, handsome, and honest, educated English women to cross the Atlantic and join the colony and marry planters shows just how interconnected these families were who had gone to Virginia with those back home. And her book shows what kind of genealogical research can now be done for people at this time. And James Evans talks about the similar pathways that we saw in Albion Seeds that led the English to the New World. But he describes the earlier context with the fish and fur and gold enticements, religious freedoms and liberties, and of course, those who went because of their loyalties to the king. But I think only he is the one that looks at the poor who went to America, but who left in despair. Being poor and underemployed, they saw the handbills and posters in London and Bristol and in taverns and at markets portraying migration to the English colonies in America as an adventure and a salve for the desperate who had only to sign the indenture and a cross would do. Now, of course, indentured servants didn't only go to Virginia, but many did. Of about 380,000 people who were thought to have sailed west during the 17th century, about 200,000 of them went to the Caribbean, leaving the rest to begin a new life in the North American colonies. And there's this interlink between the Caribbean as what we call the Americas, stopping off points, which makes life more complicated. And we can't underestimate the interconnection between the two. And that number is huge out of a total of English population of about 5.5 million. Twice as many migrants left England to go to the Americas than from Spain. And in particular, from the 1620s to the early 1640s, some 80,000 English left their homeland. Of the 200,000 who went to the English colonies, about half were indentured servants. In places like Virginia, where the demand was high, the proportion was even larger, more like 3/4. And the 1650s were the peak of emigration from England and Wales, with more than 7,000 per year. And it's only those that are documented in some way that we know about. It may be higher. Now, I do recommend a couple of websites, and I think Find My Past is not as used as much as it should be. It's got some good historical background to some of the records, and because it's growing for America, it has some good growing guides and databases that you might find useful. The Find My Past blog gives a good guide to indentured servitude and gives a useful link to a handful of good sources for indentured servitude, which are available to genealogists today. Sadly, there are only few records of indentured servitude. The process often included the indenture itself, as well as a newspaper enticement upon arrival, as a newspaper advertisement upon arrival. Then the sale of the indenture to the buyer was typically recorded at a city court or with the town leadership. The blog is worth reading. It gives a couple of useful websites you might want to look at. There is the Price Genealogy website, which makes free a database it's been creating for immigrant servants. And it includes the names of over 20,000 indentured servants who emigrated to America between 1607 and 1820. So only a fraction of what I think would be the total. There's a useful website called Virtual Jamestown, which has a searchable database called the Registers of Servants Sent to Foreign Plantations, 1654 to 1686, and that covers about 15,000 people who travelled from Bristol, Middlesex and England. And it's really just these fragments of records that survive that we know about. They travelled to the mid-Atlantic colonies and the West Indies. Dr. Carson Gibb and the Maryland State Archive offer the newer a website or a database called the New Early Settlers of Maryland, compiled from two major texts dealing with that period. Maryland is unique as the colony, incorporating the process of head rights, where a person could be granted 50 acres of land for every additional person that he transported there. There are few records, but I will mention a few. All the early passenger lists, in inverted commas, that are known about are pretty much published, and you'll find them on Find My Past, Ancestry and in prints. But Find My Past has a good database called the Early Emigration from Britain 1635 to 1815 collection, and it's worth looking at that. And there's also a British Indentured Servitude project on Wikitree, and that's where people can collaborate online family trees of indentured servants who went to the colonies. Most of these records are index only, reflecting how few paper records remain. Remember, these are often personal transactions between an individual and a ship's captain or private landowner, so finding the actual indenture agreement is rare. By the system of indenture, any person over 15 could sign himself over to a shipping merchant, who in return for free passage could sell him into servitude for a period from 2 to 7 years. And I should say it's him or her. Bristol, the principal port for emigration to America, dispatched some 10,000 indentured servants between 1654 to 1759, and they are quite well recorded and published, as you can see here, in the title Bristol in America, and you'll find this incorporated into many of the websites. And in truth, it's fair to say there was little to distinguish the indentured servant from the transported convict once he or she had crossed the Atlantic. Next. And unfortunately, there are many more records relating to indentured servitude for the 18th century than there are for the 17th century. And I just show you here to show how upsetting it is that the Indentured Servants Register from 1718 to 1822, found at the Corporation of London Records in the London Metropolitan Archives, is enticing, but sadly there's no equivalent really for the 17th century out of London. And the 18th century register gives names and destinations for servants going to the colonies, with young boys and girls listed going to Maryland, Pennsylvania, and Jamaica. But there just really aren't the same records for the earlier century. And I submit that those fragments that do survive are but a fraction of what must have happened. Now let's have a look at those who went involuntary. Transportations to the Americas. From the early 1600s, transportation was used as a means of punishment, with the shipping of convicts from the British Isles, originally to the West Indies and America, and then later to America. Between 1615 and 1699, the English courts sent, that we know of, 2,300 convicts to the American colonies. In the 1700s, prior to the end of the practice in 1776, another 52,000 or more arrived. And again, only about 30% of the total number of white indentured servants who had gone, and less than 20% of the number of enslaved Africans who entered the colonies at the same time. Now, 80% of transport convicts were sent to Maryland and Virginia, which suggests a sizable minority went elsewhere. So please don't just listen to the New Englanders that say they never had any convicts. Of the approximately 41,000 convicts sent to the two colonies, and admittedly we're talking in the 18th century, Virginia received a little less than half, or about 20,000 colonies and felons. Now, prior to the Transportation Act of 1718, which tidied up how these convicts should be sent to America, the shipment of convicts to the colonies was conducted in a very haphazard way by merchants who signed up to receive the felons from the court, waited until they had enough to get them on had a ship full, and basically sailed off. And it wasn't really until the 18th century when Parliament decided that this needed to be sorted out to underwrite a systematic approach of transporting non-capital felons to the colonies, that it gets on a much more stable footing. Now, Evans, in his book, The Reasons Why the English Went to the Americas, does cite some court reports and court cases from the 17th century relating to the theft of children who were thought to have been spirited away to provide cheap labour for the American colonies. And late in the 1630s, the mayor and aldermen of London complained bitterly about youths being enticed away to plantations beyond the seas without the consent of either of their parents, friends and masters. And a few years later, during the Civil Wars, Parliament issued orders that anyone guilty of such abduction should be brought to severe punishment. Outgoing ships were to be searched for concealed men, women and children, and charges were brought against one captain from Bristol who was described as an old rogue who tricked many men before bringing them out of the country. And as we have seen, there were some detailed registers of emigrants kept in Bristol from the mid-17th century called servants sent to foreign plantations, and these came about because of the many complaints made to Bristol City's mayor and the aldermen about the inveigling, purloining, carrying and stealing away of boys, maids and other persons and transporting them beyond the seas without any knowledge. And I suspect few, if any, such cases were documented. Now, a year after the restoration of King Charles II, so around about 1661, there was a royal commission tasked to look at the question of abuses to servants' transportation. Agents who shipped servants were dubbed soul stealers, but the removal of the unemployed, impoverished, burdensome people suited the government, and particularly the government of the City of London. And of course, the colonies needed labour. So I think there was a lot of blind eye turning to the abduction and encouragement of sweeping up of the poor, teeming Londoners. And I think it's here that we see that the removal of these unemployed, impoverished, burdensome people provided the colonies with labour. those who emigrated voluntarily were the lower middle class. Those who went involuntarily were the destitute, the teeming poor of London who had been a problem. And indeed, there was the Council for Foreign Plantations reported in 1664 that people are increased principally by sending servants, implying that the colonies benefited by having the servants sent to them. With hindsight, the trade in indentured servants formed the backbone of the whole migratory movement, but I think it underestimates the number of poor who probably went as well. And there was dreadful famine in England, as I said, in 1623, and many died on the street for want of food. And the 1630s saw only one good harvest in the whole decade. The 1640s saw 5 harvest failures in a row. And again, in 1657 and 1661, there were problems. Whole industries, like the cloth industry, with weavers, stocking makers, etc., were collapsing. With wages generally low, travel to America offered a way out of this, even if they were sent rather than went of their own accord. Next slide, please. Now, Peter Wilson Coldham's books, The Complete Book of Emigrants in Bondage from 1614 to 1775, include all the names of those we know that went in the 17th century. And it takes the records of convict transportations from the various circuit assize records held at the National Archives, and the Middlesex transportation orders from 1682 to 1787, which are held at the London Metropolitan Archives. But if you read this book, you realise that only some of the quarter session records recording criminal transportation to America survives. And there are many quarter session records that either have not been looked at yet, or when Peter Wilson Coldham has looked at them, he found he hadn't had a chance to extract all the information, or that there was no criminal record surviving. Next slide. And of course, not everyone transported to America was a criminal. Here's a case study of the 3 orphan boys with wonderful William Gentleman, I suspect he wasn't poor child, William Jones and Thomas Haythorne, who were living rough on the streets of the city in 1684. Many children who had no one to look after them ended up in the same situation, and a scheme was set up to send street children to America as servants. And in 1684, the Lord Mayor offered these 3 boys a deal. They could go to America as servants to a new master, John Lightfoot, the Virginian planter, or be punished. So William Gentleman agreed to serve Lightfoot for 15 years, William Jones for 12 years, and Thomas Haythorne for 10 years. The time they served would be measured from the date of their arrival in Virginia. Each boy was given his indenture or apprenticeship agreement to keep safely, and from now on they were indentured servants. And the story following their journey from London streets to Virginia and life on the plantations can be found in an online exhibition with the illustrating documents from the London Metropolitan Archives, which you can find on their website as part of the LMA City Communities website. The exhibition was called Packed Off to America, and they so you've got the link there, and it's worth looking at some of the register of the transportees, which are from the Corporation of London, the mayor's records in the end of the 17th century. Now, the commonest questions when anyone asks me about their colonial ancestry tends to start with, my ancestor arrived in New England in 1635 or in Virginia from 1623. And the minute they mention these dates, I kind of know where the sources have come from. Next slide, please. There are very few surviving passenger lists, and the ones that are really quite fragmentary and published in many places, whether it's here as on Find My Past, and it's Britain, Early Immigration to Barbados, the Britain registers of licenses to go overseas, etc. The most important survivals really only survive from these records to pass overseas from 1634 to 5. There's a fragment from the London Port books surviving for the same year. And this was not the only port and certainly not the only year when migrants left, but it's the only one that really has any records that survive. The licenses to pass overseas are at National Archives in TNA Exchequer Records 157, and they're commonly known as the Registers of License to Pass Beyond the Seas, 1573 to 1677. They're well published in many of the literature, in journals, in and volumes, and have ended up on Find My Past. But more importantly, they've taken the published indexes and put the original documents with them. And I have to say that they've normally been transcribed and indexed quite well. I found very few mistakes when I've been comparing the published version to the records. These licenses reflect the fact that after 1609, all travellers over the age of 18 had to take an oath of allegiance to the monarch, which is registered with the clerk of the passes and led to the issuing of a licence to travel overseas. There was an expectation that the licence could be used quickly, and indeed some were time limited, or might specify that a return to England within a specific period. And the dates shown in the records are the date the oath was made and the dates of issue of the licence, not necessarily the date of actual departure. And a good proportion of these licenses were actually soldiers, including mercenaries, taking the oath of allegiance before departing in English shores to serve in the Low Countries with the Protestant side during the Dutch revolt. However, others are unemployed or underemployed artisans looking for work, as I said, for example, weavers, or people visiting friends and family in the colonies, or simply travelling for the pleasure. Others are Protestant refugees from the Low Country visiting relatives. And these fragments show about 5,000 passengers licensed to embark to the Americas, and they're tremendously rare early survivals, with people being bound to go to Barbados, Bermuda, Boston, Charleston, Providence Island, Salem, St. Christopher, Maryland, and Virginia, mostly within the 1630s, but with some outliers, such as 1677. They were published in the Complete Book of Emigrants by Peter Wilson Coldham, or the original list of persons of quality and planters of the Commonwealth, but now they're online as well. But I submit that these are only a fraction of what there might have been. They're the fragmentary documents that give us a glimpse of what might have been if the records had survived. So, next slide, please. It's absolutely incumbent that you check the literature of what's been published, because most of the sources and what we know about the early immigrants and the records relating to their migration is published. Be aware of the passenger immigration lists indexes edited by Philby and his successors, which are now on Ancestry. And as well as trawling through online published pedigrees, be aware of major bibliographies that will lead to published research in monographs, journals, etc. Please be aware if any research has been done before and published in the major American Genealogical Society journals, such as that published by the New England Historic Genealogical Society, and publications that require sources and citations so that you know where this information has come from. I've mentioned that Peter Wilson Coldham was a prolific indexer and compiler of the sources that we know of relating to migrants to America. Many of his works were republished in various editions, and often the later editions omitted some of the more nuanced commentary of the earlier versions. And the later editions or those that have ended up on the internet don't always indicate so clearly what was left out of the records that he looked at, or what was not able to be included in his works. His works are often found on Ancestry and Find My Past, but please don't go straight to the index names without reading any commentary or instructions that he gave. Next slide, please. You can find Peter Wilson Coldham's books using the card catalogue on Ancestry, particularly the Bonded Passengers to America, More Emigrants in Bondage, 1649 to 1775, American Loyalists for the 18th century, of course, the English Adventurers and Emigrants, Child Apprenticeships to America from Christ Hospital in London, another source of sending poor children overseas, the Bristol Registers of Servants that I mentioned, the English Adventurers and Emigrants. All of these are worth looking at before you go any further into primary source material. And they are quite well resourced and sourced. And just blow them up a bit there, really showing what he knows about someone who migrated, what sources they've been found in, whether they've been apprenticed, etc. Lots of questions I see there.
Well, let's try to get to as many as we can. And I know
okay.
It's good to mention too that, if we don't get to your question today, you will find, Elsa's email address on the handout. So if you do have a more specific question, certainly you can take that offline as well and email her directly. So let's see. Mary asks, do you know of any genealogical histories that were written on the persons involved in the gunpowder plot?
Oh, there's probably lots. I think, to be honest, if you Googled gunpowder plot and looked at the references at the bottom, you'd find lots of books citing the names of the families like Catesby, the Catesbys, etc., involved in that. Yes. I'm sure they'll be relatively easily to find just by simply Googling gunpowder plot and looking at the references with it at the bottom of the Wikipedia answer. That's a good place to start, I think.
Okay, and you've mentioned people being poor and people being destitute. Catherine asks, what's the difference between poor and destitute in how you're kind of using those terms?
I think destitute means that you really can't do anything against what your betters decide to do for you. If they decide that you're thieving, you're found begging and vague and wandering and have no home, and no means of employment, then you're pretty much destitute at the bottom of the heap. The working poor, those who were scraping by on the land, perhaps, are just that slight, nuanced level higher.
Okay. And Lola asks, which counties were considered part of East Anglia?
Well, pretty much Norfolk, Suffolk, bits of Essex, into Cambridgeshire and a bit of Lincolnshire, really.
And you talked about kind of what passenger lists have survived and what exist, and it's pretty fragmentary. But Cynthia asks, are there records of people who sailed to Barbados and then to New England? I mean, is that kind of either a separate study project or separate?
They tend to get bound up in the same passenger and immigrations lists because the licenses to go overseas, which showed some people going to Massachusetts, also included people going to Barbados and things like that. So they're pretty much in the same sources together.
And related to the passenger lists, Christine asks, is there a listing of ships and ship captains? She says, my ancestor is supposedly from Bristol and was a ship's captain. So would you find a list?
There are some bits of the Bristol port books that survive. really, if that's the family story and you've got some credence in there, then you want to start looking for what records of the Bristol port books might survive, and that's where some of those indentured servants have come from. If he was a ship captain taking indentured servants over to America from Bristol, he may even be mentioned in the servants' register. From the 18th century, we know all the ship's captains who took the convicts over, for example. So it's a bit, but I think sort of just to see what might survive for the right period in Bristol port books is anything I can think of.
All right, and Linda asks if you could compare using Find My Past versus Ancestry for the best information on 17th century family.
You have to use both. I suspect everything that is published and printed is well within Ancestry. It's just I find it a bit overwhelming of trying to find it, whereas I think there is a dedicated subset within Find My Past tends to put quite a few really useful data sets together.
All right, and Caroline asks, when records refer to a person becoming a freeman, does that mean that he or she was an indentured servant prior to that?
I might need to ask a bit more detail of there. What records describe somebody as a freeman? Are they a freeman in England or a freeman in America? I mean, depends on the context. If you want to send me the context, perhaps I can think a bit more. A freeman has a definite definition. If we're talking about somebody in England in an English town, he's a freeman. He's become a freeman of the guild or corporation that's running this town, and he's done that because he's either served an apprenticeship in the town and now can take on his own apprentices, or he's become a freeman because he's paid enough amount of money, or he's become a freeman because he has married a freeman's daughter. Those are some of the major ways of becoming a freeman in an English town, which gives him certain rights and responsibilities.
All right, I know that there are a lot of questions and we only have so much time. We have one more section left, so unfortunately I'm going to move on, but we'll try to get to a few more questions at the end. And I did just put in Elsa's email to the chat.
I'm going to get inundated. I'm going to get inundated, aren't we?
Okay.
Okay.
Move on.
Oh, hang on. All right. How many slides have I got left? Oh, only 40 in 15 minutes. I'm going to talk quick. Okay, so this is where I want you to start thinking about how to prepare your research, the things that you really ought to have done before you start researching in the UK. You need to absolutely know what's been done before, and then I'll have a quick look at some of the overview of the sources we're going to be looking at in the course, and then some of the archive and repositories that might help you. So you absolutely have to know as much about your earliest immigrant ancestry as you can, and be aware of the family, the associations, and the network that he moved in. You need to know who they are, their name, what did they do in their lives, when did they come, where did they turn up, and if you can, try and have some clue that might suggest where you might be looking for them. So make sure you've searched all the online search sites, Family Search and other online sites for pedigrees. See if you can perhaps localize the name in the UK. See if it's common, but I'm afraid some common names are going to be everywhere. Absolutely, who are you looking for? What are you looking for? What do you know? When are you looking? Time period is absolutely vital to know what kind of records they want. And more importantly, if you have an idea of a place in England, which I know is the most difficult thing to come by, please look for clues for that. Next slide. So once you You need to look to see what research has been done before. Know as much as you can about your identified immigrant ancestor. Know what research is done before. Read everything that's been published online and in books and journals. Exhaust the local resources from the local archives and archives. You must have gone through all the appropriate databases and journals and citations that are possibly there, and then exhaust all the lineage and local genealogical society records. I don't know who at NEHGS said it, whether it was David Dearborn, David Lambert, Chris Charles, Bob Anderson, Brenton Simons, or indeed everybody there, but it's been said many, many times that early colonial English immigrants are probably the most genealogically studied group on the planet. So what there is to know is probably known, and most surviving records that deal with their actual migration has been thoroughly trawled through over 200 years of intense genealogical research. Now, much of that is easier to do now, to recreate, to see what's been done before, and you can see if there are digital records and pedigrees online. Next slide. So you must read the bibliographies and biographies of the migrants of the Great Migration, for example, in those magisterial volumes edited by Bob Anderson and published by the New England Historic Genealogical Society and American Ancestors. Make sure you familiarise yourself with what is known through the Great Migration study. Next slide. In short, buy and read Bob Anderson's books if they're appropriate to your research. Next slide. Check the current research in quick guides like Martin Hollick's Bibliography of New Englanders in the 1600s, a guide to genealogical research published between 1980 and 2010. And there are comparable bibliographies and works for other states looking at English colonies in the 17th centuries. So dig them out for the states you think your ancestors came to and established exactly what you know about that person. Of course, you've gleaned everything that there is from online research and websites, but don't ignore similarly useful early bibliographies that will help you establish if a family history has been published on English families, and particularly seek out and look for the works, the Genealogist Guide by George Marshall, published in 1903, a Genealogical Guide by J.B. Whitmore in 1953, a Catalogue of British Family Histories by T.R. Thompson, and the Genealogist Guide by J.B. Barrow. Next slide. Now, the oldest of these, George Marshall's The Genealogist Guide, is readily available on the Internet Archive. We've published it on the Society of Genealogists website for members, and it's typical of the bibliographies I'm referring to. It's arranged by surname, and here I have pulled out, just to make bigger, the entries for the name Minishall, and it gives abbreviated titles of journals and source material where at least 3 generations of narrative family history has been published on the name Minishall. So the journal Miscellanea Genealogica Heraldica, the Cheshire and Lancashire Historic Societies, Tuckett's Devonshire Pedigrees, Visitations of Devon. Every one of those titles has at least 3 generations worth of family history material, and we've got them all in the Society of Genealogists library, and they're probably readily available through the Internet Archive, etc. So, for example, you can see there's Ormerod's Cheshire, Volume 3, has some information, and on the next slide you can see the example of what that leads to. And there you have a pedigree going back well beyond the 1600s that's been published in the 1870s for, I think it's that day, I can't quite see the date at the bottom there. And this is pretty typical of a 3-generation of pedigree of genealogical notes that Marshall has led you to. And of course, like any secondary source, you'll try to establish how credible it is, verify the information from original records, and establish whether it's trustworthy, just as you would do for any family tree and research you find online, right? Of course. And yes, of course, the most documented families are the landed minor gentry families who've got coats of arms. But as we've seen, a substantial number of these families had sons and daughters in America. And you'd expect the libraries to collect published collected genealogies, such as those shown here, the county family histories, Foster's Yorkshire pedigrees, the Victoria history of the County of England, Hertfordshire families volume. And those are just some example of where you might find compiled collected reference books of family history research for county families. Next slide, please. We have an area in the upper library at the Society of Genealogists, which with no disrespect intended, we called Snob's Corner. And it's here you'll find the reference works that you'd expect a good genealogical library to have, relating to the members of the peerage and royalty, the baronetages and knights, the gentry, and the heraldic visitation pedigrees relating to those families, and of course antiquarian and scholarly pedigrees and biographical reference works, the Dictionary of National Biography, Who's Who. All of these you ought to be familiar with. There's a whole slough of compilations and reference works relating to peerage families, and many of these have been used as in making that wonderful website, which you really need to be aware of, thepeerage.com. Next slide. And again, thepeerage.com includes many of these works for the baronages, the baronetages, the sort of the lesser ranks of the peerage, just above the gentry. Again, all these degrees of peerage and peers of the realm, that or the aristocracy as you'd call them, which was similarly useful for finding families in the 17th century, again often to be found in the peerage.com. The gentry are have their reference works as well. They're technically known as the commoners. You might have known we have the House of Lords and the Commons, and that has that's where that comes from. But they don't. Often these families didn't like being called commoners. So this is where the term landed gentry comes in. These are the gentry families who packed the ships to America, if you believed every published genealogy. Next slide, please. Some of the pedigrees, and again, I'll go into more detail later on about what a visitation is, but some of the pedigrees created by the regular visitations made in the 1600s, the 17th century, are published and are readily available, usually published by the Harleian Society. Next slide, please. And I'll draw your attention to the Harleian Society volumes, which in addition to publish the county collections of pedigrees drawn from heraldic visitations made in the 16th and 17th centuries, they publish many compiled pedigree series edited by Joseph Foster, such as his Yorkshire families, or Arthur Campling's East Anglian pedigrees. And you'll find many of these works from the Harleian Society published on the Internet Archives, as well as good genealogical libraries, notably in Boston, I should say. Next slide, please. You really want to have a look at some of the older periodicals. We've got many of them in the SOG library, and I'd look at the works by Stuart Raymond, because he actually, like Marshall, he draws out what family histories have been printed in journals like The Ancestor, The Genealogist, and Miscellanea Genealogica et Heraldica. Do try and get hold of those bibliographies, because they will lead you to many pedigrees in the older scholarly journals. Next slide, please. There's a list of some of the scholarly journals that you really ought to be aware of. They can be a bit tricky to find. Again, the Internet Archive will lead you to them, and many of them are indexed by Whitmore, Marshall, or Stuart Raymond. So a good way of saying, has anything been published in English? I said we'd look briefly at what's going to come in the course. As I mentioned, we'll be looking at these records. I'll explain the terminology in them. And some of the records we'll be looking at as we go on in the next slide, please. We'll be looking at the records that governed our ancestors from the parish with the officials of the constables, the accounts, the church wardens, how they affected the poor law, as well as the parish records of baptisms, marriages and burials. Next slide, please. You'll hear about the parish registers and how they technically should take us all back to 1538 when they were introduced, but I have to say not all parish registers survive back to that period, and I'll be talking to you about how you can use those, particularly for the 17th century. And given how important faith was to our 17th century ancestors, we'll try to establish how to research those who stood apart from the established Church of England, whether at the beginning of the century or here at towards the end, when in fact they made what was called a census, compiled by Bishop Compton, to identify how many parishes had nonconformists within them, and we'll talk about how to use that work. I mentioned we'll look at heraldic visitation pedigrees compiled by the College of Arms in the 16th and 17th centuries, which are the source of many of the pedigrees that you'll have found online. Next slide, please. We'll talk about using the church courts, which proved wills, and how the church courts were in abeyance for a large part of the middle of the 17th century, and so how finding a will can be tricky in the 17th century. I use this one, although Lawrence Spencer died in 1719, he was clearly born in the middle of the 17th century, and he mentions in this his son in St. Christopher, if he's still alive, in the West Indies, and on the right in the at the bottom, I've taken one of the earliest wills known of for somebody in Massachusetts that's actually with a record proven in the probate records of the Prerogative Court of Canterbury in the National Archives. So it is, you will find wills of colonialists in the church court records, and the church courts dealt with probate at this period, and I'll explain how that works. Next slide, please. And of course, all the other things that the church courts did, dealing particularly not just with probate, but with sin and sex. If you've read the Naked Quaker by Diane Rappaport, which looks at true crimes and controversies from the courts of colonial England, you'll be very familiar with the raucous stories that you find in our English church courts, which are very concerned with the moral welfare of our miscreant ancestors. I think they're the most underused source for English genealogy, and I'm sure I want to explain to you how you can get into those. The 17th century has got some inventive ways of taxing people, and I'm going to be talking about all the tax records that you can find that list people at a certain time at a certain place. Next slide, please. And the places they lived in are often within the manors in the countryside. And I'll be talking about manorial records, the court leet, the records that survive for the governance of the manor that your ancestors lived on. And I have to say that the English taught the American cousins everything they know about civil litigation. And while many will be aware of the vast amount of potential information to be drawn out in the cases of Chancery, which is our largest civil court, that even more is to be found in other civil courts, which are not necessarily well catalogued and indexed online. And we'll have a quick look at these civil courts and indeed some of the criminal and quarter session courts as well. More and more is being catalogued from here, and I think this is one of the places where you will be finding more and more breakthroughs, and discoveries will come from greater access to tax records, manorial and ecclesiastical courts, chancery and chequer courts, when they are much better catalogues. And you will learn to make regular visits back to the National Archives discovery catalogues and the websites and catalogues of the appropriate English county record offices who were adding more and more to them. So let's have a look at these last three just to finish off. The main repository for the records of how the Crown and government interacted with its citizens through its records of state and state papers, the Treasury and Exchequer, and civil and criminal courts are to be found at National Archives in Kew. And throughout the course, I'm going to call it TNA, and you really do have to master its catalogue. But more and more gems are being catalogued and listed, and often down to name level. So it's worth revisiting the catalogue of the National Archives, which is known as the Discovery Catalogue. Next slide, please. Now, many of your ancestors are going to hail from London, and the largest record office after the TNA is the London Metropolitan Archives, or the LMA as we call it. We'll mention many records relating to 17th century migrants held there, and it's worth spending a few moments understanding the meaning of what the City of London is and how it worked in the 17th century, and the records of some of the other towns and cities in London, it's outside London, found in the local record offices, like here for an example, the local Essex Record Office in Chelmsford, which has got much to offer for 17th century researchers looking for migrants to the English colonies from Essex. You'll find details and links to all the local and regional archives through the National Archives Discovery Catalogue on its website. It's got a section called Find an Archive, and that links you to every archive we have in the country. So if you bookmark that, that's your guide to all record offices, their catalogues and websites. It's not all online yet, and it's not all in one place, but it's working on it. And of course, I might mention of the library of the Society of Genealogists throughout the course, because I've got to give it a plug, haven't I? And I want to reassure you that it is worth taking the course. There is genealogy to be found, but we just have to search harder for it in all sorts of places. And any breakthroughs that come will be because of greater access to previously uncatalogued and or unindexed source material, such as Chancery and Exchequer courts, tax, ecclesiastical courts, and petitions, which is really the growing work where this is where many more records are becoming available for the 17th century. And as they become more readily available, catalogued and name indexed, I'll show you how to walk down the research pathways to find these records and hopefully offer some success. We should be finishing, but I'm happy to have a few questions to conclude.
Okay, great. Well, thank you. And it's a nice overview of what's to come. So it's a great preview as well. So yes, a few questions before wrapping up. And as I mentioned, I shared Elsa's email address in the chat, and it's also there on the course webpage. So hopefully you're not too inundated, but we have lots of time for questions in the coming weeks as well. So okay. Mary asks, what sort of English immigrants came to New York in the late 1600s?
Well, I think they're the ones who sort of ventured north. I think the answer is all of them, to be perfectly honest. They all had, this is where we've got the story of the long tail of the ones that didn't follow the set paths. They weren't the three major ones, the Puritans, the Virginians, or the Quakers. And so they're probably the ones which are the most complicated to find, because they didn't come with a set network. They didn't necessarily come from any one place.
All right. And Peter asks, we talked a lot about indentured servants. So what would be the best way to determine if your, say, New England ancestor was an indentured servant? What source would you go to first? You've got
to go through everything that the Complete Migration has listed thus far, everything that's through American Ancestors, to get any clue that the clues are going to be more on your side than our side, to be perfectly honest. Okay, so more in New England records. Yes, yeah. Absolutely, yeah. To give a clue, because to be honest, most of the records that we know of indentured servants where the records have survived in this country have been published. All right, and Paul asks, were there regular records of apprenticeships, and have many survived? The answer is yes, but in the towns and cities, if they were apprenticed through guilds, um, yes, is the answer to that. So the answer is depending where your ancestors came from, there will be some records, but there's no central database of them all, I'm afraid.
Okay, and Catherine asks, how do we deal with the handwriting?
Ah, well, I think I sent. I think we have got a guide to paleography
Yes, we
that
do.
we've got a handout to give to you, and a link to some free online paleography classes that the National Archives offers, with practice of reading documents from the 17th century, particularly wills and probate. So there's plenty to give you practice and help. If that handout hasn't gone out yet, Genevieve, it will do, won't it?
Yes, it's actually already on the course
Yeah,
webpage on the
thought it might
left-hand
be.
side. Yep, so it's up there, and those are two PDFs that you can download, and it kind of walks through
Hmm.
some suggestions on reading handwriting. So great question, Catherine, and we already have you covered. Um, let's see. Kelly does ask, will you be reviewing any Guildhall records and how to access them?
I will. I'll see if I can get some time in. Yes, I'll make a point of talking about London and local stuff as well. Yeah.
All right. Well, thank you. And thank you again, Elsa, for being with us and for all of this great information. I think this first class has really given us a lot of context and a preview of what's to come in the next few weeks. And as I mentioned, we'll have lots of time in the coming weeks to answer your questions as well. So thank you, everyone, for joining us for the first class. You will find a recording, a full recording of this program, which includes the Q&A. On the course webpage. You see it there on your screen, a very long URL. I will include that in my email to you once the recording is posted. And I will also be emailing you each week as we post the slides and the handouts. So you'll hear from me quite a few times over the next few weeks, but just to keep you updated on what's happening with the course and when materials are available, you'll have until the end of February to access all of this content. So thank you again for joining us. Be sure to join us next week at the same time when we dive into researching before 1700, and we'll take a closer look at state papers, tax records, heraldic visitations, quarter sessions, and records of recusants and other dissenters, as well as soldiers of the English Civil Wars. If you'd like to access more how-to resources or learn about upcoming online educational programs, please visit our online learning center at americanancestors.org/education. Stay safe, stay healthy, and I look forward to seeing you online next week. Goodbye for now.